Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media, joined by Scott Dunford, pastor of Western Hills Church in San Mateo, California. Scott, it's good to see your smiling face today, and it's good to be here bringing you another episode. Now, we just last week did kind of a deep dive into the headlines. Scott, I was encouraged by that, really just seeing the whole world in light of the Lordship of Christ and our Lord's purposes in the world, accomplishing his will. But you know what? As encouraging as that big picture is, Scott, sometimes we zoom in on a particular country or a particular context, and the picture that we see on the ground is a little bit less encouraging. And if we're going to be missions-minded people, well, it requires that we be willing to get into the mess and recognize that there's real brokenness and suffering in the world. And Scott, we want to explore one of those situations today, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, I had these two encounters. One I had a professor in college named Sam Taloyan, and he had a long name and an interesting story. I didn't know much about him. I tried to find out he was Armenian, and then I had a classmate named Chad Bogosian, and from him I actually learned a lot more about a whole part of the world I didn't know much about, a whole history of Christianity I didn't know much about, and a genocide I didn't know much about. And of course, since then, I've been made aware of many more aspects. But last week we talked about something that's unfolding right now. And so we're excited to have a special guest on, one we're just meeting now, but who's an expert in these areas and done a lot of work in studying these things. So we're welcoming Joel Veldkamp, who's joining us. And he's got lots of degrees, PhD from Geneva Graduate Institute, an MA in Middle Eastern Studies. Did you study under Indiana Jones there? I'm not sure. We can talk about that later. I think he taught there for a while, if history holds. And a BA from Dordt University, and currently working with the Christian Solidarity International. So welcome to the show. With all that, I'm sure you probably never got a better introduction. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to study this area.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here with you today, Alex and Scott. I'm just a kid from Iowa, and was doing my undergrad at Dordt University back in the day, and we had an option to study abroad somewhere. And I knew I wanted to do that, but I didn't really know where. And I kind of just looked at the options, and I picked Egypt at random. And I went for a semester, and it was really my first time outside the country. And it was just one of the most intense experiences of my life, right? Like, I felt like the colors were brighter and the tastes were deeper and everything was just more intense. And from that moment on, I was totally hooked on everything in the greater Middle East. I won't say it's like a holy calling or anything like that. It's just something that grabbed onto me, and I've been chasing it ever since. So I had the great privilege to spend a year in Syria after I finished my undergrad, right before the war started there. And now I work for Christian Solidarity International, which is an organization that works to help persecuted Christians around the world. And the Middle East and North Africa are big areas of focus for us. Yeah, I count myself very blessed that I'm able to continue to stay in touch with this region that I love so much, but also hopefully follow the Lord's calling and help our brothers and sisters there in our own small way.
Joel, thanks for sharing some of that. And we want to give you a chance to talk about Christian Solidarity International at the end. But for now, bring us into the context of what's happening with the Armenian Christian population right now, especially in this part of the world, which I'm sure most of us couldn't find on a map. I'm not even entirely sure I can pronounce it, so I'm not even going to attempt. But talk to us about this region and what's happened here, most recently at a high level.
So in the past 16 days, one of the world's most brutal dictatorships has destroyed one of the world's oldest Christian communities. It's gone. It's been destroyed. That's, if you remember one thing from this interview about what's happened over the past few months to Armenian Christians, that's what happened. Most of the world was not even aware of it, but it happened that way. So this is a region called Nagorno-Karabakh. And yeah, it's impossible to pronounce almost. The alternate name for it is Artsakh, which isn't much easier. But if you're looking for it on a map, it's in between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, which is, yeah, as you can imagine, quite a difficult space to live in.
It's the trifecta of great places to live, sure.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So in that in that space in between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, there are three smaller countries called Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Georgia and Armenia are both culturally, historically Christian nations. Azerbaijan is a Muslim nation, a Muslim Turkish nation, historically. And the Armenians, they lay claim to the title of the first Christian nation. And that's because in the year 301 AD, their king officially converted to Christianity and brought his whole nation along with him. Some years before Emperor Constantine did the same thing for the Roman Empire. And it's quite a dramatic story of how it happened. There was, of course, two of Jesus' apostles went to Armenia, according to the tradition, in the first few decades after the Lord's visit. I want to say Thomas and Thaddeus. Someone in the audience will check me on that. But Christianity was kind of underground in Armenia for a few centuries after that. And then there was this one really, really stubborn guy named Gregory who just would not leave the king alone and kept evangelizing to the king, witnessing to the king, spreading the gospel. And finally, the king of Armenia shut him up in a prison in this remote hilltop at the base of Mount Ararat, and he was living in a hole for something like 17 years. And at the end of the 17 years, the king had a come to Jesus moment and realized that Gregory had been telling the truth, and he converted and let Gregory out of the pit. And today this man is known as Gregory the Illuminator because he was the first head of the Armenian Orthodox Church. So ever since then, Christianity has just been baked into the Armenian nation, the Armenian culture. So they're still very proud of this long Christian heritage that they have. But the Armenian history has also been one of great suffering. Scott mentioned a little bit ago the great genocide of 1915 to 1923. And that's really where our story begins. And as Alex mentioned, this is quite a complicated story, but I'll try to hit only the pertinent points. During World War I, most of what is today the Middle East was ruled by the last Islamic empire, which was called the Ottoman Empire. And the military rulers of the Ottoman Empire decided that all the Christians of what is today Turkey were a security threat to their existence. So they decided to liquidate them. And this meant massacring whole villages of Christians. These were mostly Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, or just marching them into the desert to die. The official orders coming from Istanbul said that you have to move all of the Armenians into Syria, and they can't be more than 10% of the population in any one place. Well, there were 2 million Armenians, and there were 2 million people in Syria, so do the math. About 1.5 million people were murdered during the genocide, and many more were forcibly converted to Islam. Many more were enslaved. Many women, Christian women especially, were enslaved and forced to marry Muslim men. It said that lots of Turkish people today have an Armenian grandmother or an Armenian great-grandmother in their lineage because of this enslavement during the genocide. In Western accounts, in Western media, Western popular imagination, that's usually where the story ends. And the survivors are kind of dispersed across the world. They move to Los Angeles, they move to France, they move to New Jersey and carry on the memory of the genocide. But in reality, in the East, the genocide didn't end there because many survivors of the killings fled from the Ottoman Empire into the Russian Empire in the area of what is today Armenia and Azerbaijan. Remember, this was World War I. So at the same time that the genocide is happening in the Ottoman Empire, what's happening in Russia? Communist revolution, right? And so the whole Russian Empire is thrown into chaos, and eventually Lenin decides to withdraw all the Russian troops from Armenia. And the Armenians decide to make their own country, declare independence, and the Ottoman Empire decides to invade Armenia. So they invade from the west, they come in, and they massacre tens of thousands of Armenians, maybe hundreds of thousands. It's difficult to be sure. But their main objective is not just to kill people. Their objective is to link up with their Turkish Muslim brothers on the other side of the Armenians, on the Caspian Sea. And these are the people who we know today as the Azerbaijanis. So from 1918 to 1920, you just have kind of continuous killing. And the killing goes both ways, but the Christians bear the brunt of it because they're up against much bigger Muslim powers. And the only way this ends is the Russians come back. And this time they're the Soviet Union. They come back, they occupy the whole area. And that is when the killing finally stops. The Russians decide to create 3 new republics in the area, the Soviet Republic of Armenia, the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan, and the Soviet Republic of Georgia. And Joseph Stalin, at the time, is the commissioner of nationalities for the Soviet Union. He's not yet the dictator of the whole thing. He's the commissioner of nationalities. And he has the brilliant idea to take this one region of Armenia called Nagorno-Karabakh, take it away from Armenia, and put it inside Soviet Azerbaijan. That way, historians debate about why he did this. Probably he wanted to make the Turks happy. He wanted to sign a peace treaty with the new Republic of Turkey. But also, it's always good to have subject peoples pitted against each other so they can't unite against you. That status quo lasts until the Soviet Union falls apart in the late 1980s. And by now, the Armenians, Christians who live in Nagorno-Karabakh have been suppressed for 70 years, right? There's not a single church left open in the region. The communists closed them all. There's not a single priest. They were all sent to Siberia, to the gulags. But people still remember. They remember their Christian identity, and they remember their faith, and they remember their national identity. They remember that they're Armenians. And so when Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power, he begins to loosen things up. He thinks maybe if we have a little more freedom of religion, a little more freedom of speech, we can make the Soviet Union into a stronger state. Of course, what actually happens is the Soviet Union flies apart into a million pieces. When that happens, the Christians in Nagorno-Karabakh say, well, we want to be free too, actually. We want our churches back. We want our priests back. We want to be free. And so they start a movement to make this region independent. And the Soviet Union does not like that at all. And Azerbaijan does not like that at all. So that's how the first war begins. That war lasts for about 6 years. It's extremely brutal. But at the end of it, by some kind of miracle, the Armenians have won. And the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh create their own republic. It's a free, independent republic. It's not recognized as independent by any other country in the world, but it functions as a free and independent republic.
Interesting.
That brings us up to 1994. How are we doing? I've covered a lot.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. So
I'm fascinated too. Maybe just two things real quick, and then pick it up from 94. So, and we'll bring it into the present day as well. So, one, would we be correct? Okay, help us out. We're two Baptists here. All right. Would we be correct to say that Armenians are under the umbrella of what we would look at as Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are they something else?
There's something slightly different. So in all the various church councils that we have in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, there's one called the Council of Chalcedon, which is one of several councils that convenes to determine what the exact nature of Jesus Christ is. And at this council, the debate is Jesus Christ fully God and fully man? Or does Jesus Christ have one indivisible nature that is fully human and fully divine? And if you're having difficulty parsing that, there are lots of scholars today who think that this entire debate was basically a problem of translation between the different linguistic communities in the Christian church at the time. But anyway, the Armenians find themselves on one side of that question, and Eastern Orthodoxy finds itself on the other. So ever since that time, the Armenians and actually the Egyptian Orthodox and the Syriac Orthodox have been separate from Eastern Orthodoxy as we know it.
Understood. So they're not. So they're anti-Chalcedonian.
That's right. That's right.
We would be pro-Chalcedonian on this show for the record. We hold
I would too.
Alex had to go on record with that, of course.
I do, but we also, honestly, though, we do have this tendency as evangelicals to just dismiss, anyone from these older traditions wearing, sort of the funny hats, right? So I think it's important for us to understand, the breadth of Christian history, right, Scott?
Yeah, and I was just going to add, just from my studying of Eastern Christianity, and Joel, I'm sure you can chime in. You'll have more insight on this than I do, but often what's been called Nestorian hasn't really fit the Nestorian model, it's not true Nestorian. So maybe you can fill us in a little bit on that too as you continue.
Right. So the Armenians would not consider themselves Nestorians, certainly not. I hesitate to comment on some of these belief structures because they are complicated, and I'm not a theologian.
Sure.
But in general, the Armenians would say the Nestorians don't affirm Jesus's divinity enough. Right, that would be their problem with the Nestorians. Armenians affirm the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. They're fully Orthodox, small o, in that sense.
So bring us past 1994.
One of the reasons the Armenians were able to win the war in the early 90s was that Azerbaijan was just in a state of complete disarray. There was no political unity. Governments were falling all the time. But eventually they settle on the man who ruled Azerbaijan during the Soviet times. They decide to keep him on as their new president after all this chaos. And he transforms Azerbaijan into a familial dictatorship. And he also makes excellent use of Azerbaijan's vast oil and energy resources. So over the 26 years that follow the ceasefire of 1994, Azerbaijan becomes a fabulously wealthy country, wealthy in the sense that they have a lot of money to spend on weapons, not in the sense that the people are actually uplifted or there's some kind of economic development happening. But Azerbaijan becomes a very strong military power. In September 2020, they decide to start the war again. At first, it doesn't go very well for them, but then Turkey sends in a lot of officers to essentially begin running the war for them. And then the tide begins to turn, and they actually score a massive victory against the Armenians. And the only thing at that time that keeps the Armenians from being driven out of Nagorno-Karabakh completely is that the Russians intervene at the last second, at the 11th hour. One of the key fortress cities of the region has fallen to Azerbaijan. Russia steps in and says, okay, stop. You're doing this anymore. We're going to have a ceasefire. There's going to be Russian peacekeepers in the region. And it's going to be settled. That new status quo, it's very painful because the Armenians lose a lot of land. There are historic areas where Armenians have lived for thousands and thousands of years that are just completely ethnically cleansed. Everyone has to go. There are videos that circulate on social media of Azerbaijani soldiers beheading Armenian civilians, all kinds of war crimes and atrocities. And these are not like videos that are sleuthed out by Armenian PIs, right? These are videos that the Azerbaijanis themselves upload to the internet after they made them themselves. It's like a psychological warfare tactic. I think it's important to understand that one of the ways the Azerbaijani dictatorship has stayed in power is by fomenting a really psychotic hatred against the Armenian people.
Yeah, I want to make sure people don't miss what you just said. It's not Armenians. I'm almost saying Armenians. Armenians. It's not Armenians uploading things to the web saying, look what people are doing to us. It's Azerbaijanis uploading these videos to the internet saying, look what we've done.
Yeah. Look what we did to you. Look what we're going to do to you. Look what we can do and no one will stop us.
Joel, can you help me understand? Is it framed as basically a political conflict, or is it being framed as a religious conflict?
It really depends who is talking and who they're talking to, right? So when Armenians and Azerbaijanis speak to Western audiences, they will vigorously deny that there's anything religious about this conflict because they know that doesn't work in Western capitals.
Right.
But Azerbaijan in particular is quite willing to use religion as a weapon of war when it suits them. So one of the tactics that they used after the 2020 war was they would set up loudspeakers at the edges of Armenian villages along the ceasefire line and blast the Muslim call to prayer into these villages. It's kind of a way to say, we're here, we're coming for you. This is who we are. During the 2020 war, Azerbaijan recruited thousands of jihadists from Syria to come and fight for them. And of course, these jihadists were told, you're going to kill the kuffar, you're going to kill the infidels for us. The dictatorship of Azerbaijan is very willing to use Islamic rhetoric and Islamic Islamist ideology, we can say, as a weapon against the Armenians. But the dictatorship itself is a secular one, almost comically evil. You know, the president of Azerbaijan made his own wife the vice president, you know, and they'll float around the country. He's in his combat fatigues and she's in really, frankly, kind of skimpy outfits, you know, and this is the modern face of Azerbaijan that they present to the world. It's very, very corrupt, very full of excess, and very brutal, even to their own people. There are lots of Azerbaijani dissidents who live in Europe who have been attacked. You know, they've had men waiting outside their apartments with axes to like bludgeon them. It's one of the least free countries in the world.
You know, we have we've been reading about 120,000 of these Armenian Christian refugees facing just incredible shortages of almost everything. So what happened, in the last, couple months to just bring this to the absolute crisis that is right now?
Yeah. So when the 2020 war ended, there was this new status quo where Russia was designated as the protector of the Armenians in this region, and Armenians could go to the Republic of Armenia by a single road called the Lachin corridor. And that was their lifeline, right? That's where their fuel came from. That's where their medicines came from. That's where all their food imports came from. And that's where they would leave from if they had to go anywhere else in the world, to go through the Lachin corridor to Armenia and from Armenia to somewhere else. December 12, 2022, Azerbaijan closes the Lachin corridor. They block it with their troops. And this kind of sends everyone into a panic. They don't quite know what's going on because under the terms of the ceasefire, the Russians are not supposed to allow this to happen, but they do allow it. And everyone kind of thinks, well, a week or two, the Russians will make the Azerbaijanis move. They'll open the road again. We can get supplies back in. We can leave. And they just don't. And this blockade continues month after month for 9 months. And eventually even the Red Cross isn't allowed in. So people are literally dying. By September, the miscarriage rate in the territory had quadrupled because pregnant women couldn't get enough food to eat. There were, people dying because they couldn't get the surgeries that they needed. People dying just of hunger, very little electricity, very little fuel. The ambulances were not running because there was no fuel to put in the ambulances. It was really a starvation siege that Azerbaijan was putting on the territory. And I was in Armenia the week of September 11 to 15, and we couldn't go to Nagorno-Karabakh because of the siege, but we were able to go right up to the border, and we could see the Azerbaijani checkpoint. And on the Armenian side of the checkpoint, there were 20 trailer tractors full of humanitarian aid, just stuck. They couldn't move, they couldn't go in. And we would then call our friends in Nagorno-Karabakh on the phone, and they would say, yeah, there's no flour, there's no bread, there's just nothing. We knew that this was not a sustainable situation. But what happened at the end was 3 days after I left Armenia, Azerbaijan decided to launch another war. So on September 19, Azerbaijan attacks Nagorno-Karabakh, and they go all out. They're bombing civilian settlements, they're bombing neighborhoods. 50,000 people out of the 120,000 people who live there have to flee their homes just to escape the bombing campaign. Nagorno-Karabakh government surrenders, essentially. They say, we can't do this, please, we'll lay down our arms, we'll have negotiations with you, we'll integrate into Azerbaijan, just stop shooting. And they don't stop shooting, they keep going for at least another day. And by the end of this attack, the capital city is overrun with homeless people, with wounded people for whom there is no medicine, because again, we're 9 months into a siege and people can't travel between towns. Azerbaijani soldiers are blocking all the roads. They can't go and collect wounded people. They can't rescue wounded people. Many wounded people die because the roads are just closed by Azerbaijani troops. Most communications have been knocked out. So there are huge areas of the territory that are just black zones and we don't know what's happening. And after 5 days of that, the Russians announce, well, if you want to leave, we'll open the road for you now. And most people want to leave in this situation of like absolute terror and deprivation.
Yeah.
So between September 24 and October 1st, basically the entire Armenian Christian population left Nagorno-Karabakh. Some were escorted out of villages that were under siege by Russian peacekeepers, and others just drove themselves. And there was a 100-kilometer long line of cars driving from Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia. The drive took 30 hours for most of these cars. Normally the drive takes 1.5 hours, but there were just so many people so desperate to get out. They didn't take any belongings with them. Most of them, there was no room in the cars for that. People died on the way of thirst, of hunger. And there was a UN team finally in Nagorno-Karabakh just this week. And they said, we think there may be 50 Armenians left. And this is a region that's been inhabited by Armenians for thousands and thousands of years.
And we don't usually like to, date ourselves, but just for our audience to be able to track along, we're recording this on October 5th. I believe as things currently stand, this episode is going to be coming out on October 15th. And so things might have even changed. Honestly, I mean, I can only imagine that by the 15th, things will have worsened, at the current rate.
Could very well be. Yeah. So here on October 5th, what we're looking at as CSI and what the world is looking at is the Republic of Armenia's population has gone up by 5% in a week. And all of these people are homeless, basically penniless, possessionless.
Yeah.
Some of them have family in Armenia. Most of them don't. So it's one of the world's worst refugee crises right now. And it's a truly monumental undertaking to think of how we're going to help all these people build new lives in what is not a rich country by any means, right? Armenia is a low middle income country. It's a post-Soviet country.
Well, Joel, let me ask you this. I mean, we live at a time of all-time distrust of our governments. And so most people probably don't need you to answer the question of, well, why aren't people acting? Why aren't Western governments taking action? But let's just ask that question. I mean, the U.S., we certainly have a history of getting involved in things, right? And so is there a push to do anything here at a geopolitical level from countries like the United States or not? And if not, why not?
I don't want to encourage your listeners' conspiratorial tendencies, but I'm convinced that we are seeing the results of the push right now. This is more or less what the U.S. wanted to happen. I'll explain. This is an extremely strategic region for the U.S. In 1997, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard. And the basic theme of this book is, how do we keep Russia from becoming a superpower again? How do we make sure the U.S. remains the only superpower? And he said, there are 3 post-Soviet countries that we absolutely have to have an alliance with for this to work: Uzbekistan, Ukraine, and Azerbaijan. Huh. So having an alliance with Azerbaijan has been the U.S. priority for almost 20 years now, if not more.
Well, and Turkey is a member of NATO.
Yes.
And Turkey is going to be aligned with Azerbaijan.
Absolutely.
Right.
So Turkey is an essential ally of the U.S. and, the leaders of Turkey and Azerbaijan say their motto is 2 states, 1 nation, right? So they really see themselves as brothers in nationality, and they want to work hand in glove on everything, basically. The problem for the U.S. has been that we do have this moral issue. What do we do about these Armenians who faced genocide a century ago, who are facing ethnic cleansing now today? And we have a large Armenian population in the U.S. that is quite influential in Congress through the various lobbies. And so it's taken a while for the U.S. to get to the point where they could do this, where they could swing basically all the way to the Azerbaijani side of this debate. In the early 90s, Congress passed a law saying that no military aid can go to Azerbaijan whatsoever. In 2002, they amended that law saying that if the president says that it's a national security priority for the U.S. to send military aid to Azerbaijan, then he can. Every president has made that declaration every year since 2002. So we've seen this slow drift towards the Azerbaijani side. And what the U.S. really wants, and what they'll say openly, is that they want a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They want to put this conflict behind them. They want everyone in the region to be friends, and that way they can all be friends with the U.S. and be taken outside of the Russian camp, so to speak, and become U.S. partners. And then this critical region that's so full of energy supplies and so geostrategically located between Europe and Central Asia will become another zone of U.S. influence. Nagorno-Karabakh was the biggest obstacle to that. It was the one thing that was stopping that from happening in the eyes of U.S. policymakers.
Right.
And Azerbaijan was the stronger country in the equation. So the U.S. policy for the past 3 years has been to pressure Armenia to give Nagorno-Karabakh over to Azerbaijan. And eventually the government of Armenia did. The prime minister of Armenia came out and said, okay, fine. Nagorno-Karabakh belongs to Azerbaijan. We cry uncle. Just please, let's have the rights of the Armenians who live there respected. The Armenians who lived there thought differently. They said, no, we're not going anywhere. We're an independent state. We have our own government. We have our own army. And we don't trust the Azerbaijanis at all. So then the question was, well, how do you solve this problem? And it appears that you solve this problem with a lightning quick military operation. Certainly the US knew that this was coming, but they waited 8 hours to condemn the attack. And when they did condemn it, it was extremely weak. They said that they're deeply concerned about it or something like this. At the same time,
right,
the second day of the attack, President Biden invited the foreign minister of Azerbaijan to a private reception in New York, and they took a photo together, shaking hands and smiling.
Yeah.
So it's very clear that this is in line with the US's policy goals for the region. The problem is Azerbaijan has made it very clear that they don't intend to stop at Nagorno-Karabakh. They, according to their official line, all of what is today the Republic of Armenia is really West Azerbaijan. It's really their land. And their president has started saying things like, we have to return to our land. We have to go back there. They have weather channels that start doing weather broadcasts for West Azerbaijan. And they have alternative names for all the cities in Armenia. And
let me ask you a question real quick about that, Joel, too. I mean, if you think about the history, okay, so I don't know when the lines were drawn, but we already said Armenia 301 AD is a Christian nation. We're talking about Azerbaijan as an Islamic nation. Well, we know Islam comes along later, historically, obviously. What is the case? Is there a false history that's pushed? Is there something else that we're not aware of that they're appealing to?
Yes. There's a massive false case that's mixed with a few grains of truth, kind of classic, I guess. I'll go into all the nitty-gritty details if you want, but basically they say Armenians were brought to this region by the Russians in 1828, and they were never there before. And so when you see thousands and thousands of years of Armenian churches, Armenian inscriptions, Armenian cemeteries, Armenian monuments, that's all been faked.
So it's kind of, it's a part of Turkey reinstituting the Ottoman Empire, basically, it sounds like.
Yes, I think that's a fair description of what's going on.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting just how we've moved away from the empires, for the last, 50 years, 100 years. And now it's coming back where you have, Russia trying to reinstitute the Russian Empire. You see the same thing happening maybe with Turkey. And it's very interesting as we think about world events and what's happening right in front of our eyes with Armenia, of course, being one of these examples.
Well, and let's face it, the U.S. is an empire. We can't deny that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Scott. This is the age of empires is back with a vengeance now, and a lot of small peoples like the Armenians are going to suffer grievously because of this.
So if I can transition a little bit, John Eibner of your organization, Christian Solidarity International, talked about some of the needs, the spiritual, material, political needs, and calling for a solidarity of American Christians with the persecuted Armenian Christians. What would you say, to someone who's listening? I mean, I'm listening to this going, it's horrific and heartbreaking, and I knew something about this region already. But hearing these details obviously stirs a new sympathy. What can Christians do when global Christians hear these stories, besides praying, which obviously we should be doing, we should be definitely doing that. But how can Christians stand with their brothers and sisters from this region?
I'll go back again to the genocide of 1915 to 1923. And there again, that was a situation where the U.S. government was really determined not to be helpful. For their own reasons. They didn't want to get involved. But the U.S. church was on fire about this issue. The U.S. church mobilized for the victims of the Armenian genocide in a way that, some historians say, this is the beginning of modern humanitarianism as a concept. It was just massive. There's never been anything like that before. They raised $100 million in 1920 dollars, right? So just an insane amount of money.
Wow.
Probably helped 2 million refugees directly. And part of the way that this was working was that there was a huge American missionary presence in Turkey before the genocide began. So these missionaries were the witnesses to what happened, and they brought these stories back to their churches, and the churches mobilized in response to help their brothers and sisters. So what I take from that is the U.S. church seems almost immobilized if the U.S. government isn't involved in something. We hear a lot about Ukraine, and rightly so. It's by far the worst humanitarian disaster in the world right now, and it's just horrific what's happening there. But the U.S. government is energized about this. They're very active in it. This is their war.
Right.
And so we hear about it all the time, and we don't hear about the Armenians. And it's alarming to me that the church doesn't seem to be able to react if the US government isn't reacting. Like, that seems like a very unhealthy place for the church to be. So I guess if you're an ordinary Christian, it's important to be involved in the church and in organizations, right? So to connect with organizations that are working to help the Armenians, whether that's the organization I work for or the many others that do this. But also, why not ask your pastor? What have you heard about this? What is our national church doing about this? What is our church's relief arm doing about this? If you support ministries like Samaritan's Purse, ask them, what are you doing about this? Have you made any public statements about this? Mr. Graham, sometimes to his credit, is a very outspoken person, and he says what's on his heart. And what has he said about the destruction of one of the oldest Christian communities in the world? Maybe you should hear from some of his donors about this. I guess this is a roundabout way of saying that Christian civil society needs to act independently of the U.S. government.
I think that's such a great point of application. Yes. Honestly, it's easy to be burdened for something and to be talking about something when everyone else is. It's being that first person to whether it's to give, to write to an organization, to write to your representatives in Congress or in the Senate as well, advocating that they maybe step out from the party line. In addition to the church being the hands and feet of Christ. Joel, I mean, this is a serious episode, and we talk about all sorts of things, and there is a time and a place for this. I do want to hear from you. What, if anything, gives you hope? Is there anything that, as you look at the situation on the ground, maybe that's as simple as like, well, we believe that Jesus walked out of the grave, and because of that, we know there's hope somewhere down the line. But how that's touching down on the ground right now, we're not seeing for sure. But what are you seeing right now that gives you some sign that, in some way the Lord's at work through this, or maybe that has yet to be seen as his people actually do take action?
I'll say, as a preface, Armenia is a society that's deeply divided along political lines. These divisions are fierce, they're emotional, they're very bitter, and there's a lot of finger pointing going both ways about who's responsible for losing this war, who's responsible for losing Nagorno-Karabakh, even before the events of the past 2 weeks. And so in a sense, I was pleasantly surprised and very grateful to see that the Armenian people are really rising to the occasion right now. In the first city that you come into in Armenia after you leave Nagorno-Karabakh, the local population just mobilized in a major way to help the refugees. They're providing food, they're opening their homes to these people, they're giving them rides wherever they need to go in the country. We see, little kids getting involved. And I wasn't sure that was going to happen, to be honest, when a country is as beaten down and sad and angry as Armenia seems to be sometimes. I wasn't sure about that, but, I think we can see the Christian spirit in action and the Holy Spirit at work. So that's a point of hope, I think, that this tragedy might lead to some kind of spiritual revival among the Armenian people, a renewed sense of solidarity among Armenians, among Christians in the region.
Well, thank you so much for your work. I mean, it's clear you've studied this history and this story so intensely, and I hope that it inspires our listeners to pray and get involved and think about their role and how we can even influence our own officials about this. Tell us a little bit, if you can, just in the last few minutes here, about your work with CSI. What is CSI and how did it kind of come about, and what do you do there?
So Christian Solidarity International is a Christian human rights organization. Our mission is primarily to the persecuted church. We also help other persecuted peoples, whether that's the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, the Yazidis in Iraq. We tend to be drawn to areas where Christians are really facing true existential crises because of persecution. But when we're there, we help everyone in need. So we do aid, humanitarian aid on the ground, whether that's legal aid, whether that's getting people out of slavery, whether that's emergency relief after people have fled their homes, whether that's medical care for victims of church bombings. But we always try to combine our aid with advocacy. So we don't just go there and bring help. We also try to make sure the Christian world knows what's going on and we tried to advocate with Western governments when their policies need to change for the sake of persecuted Christians. So that's what we do, aid and advocacy for the persecuted church and for other persecuted peoples. We work in 14 different countries. One of them is Armenia, and our work there is surely going to increase now that this huge crisis is upon us. We're interconfessional, I should say. Our staff includes evangelicals, Protestants, Catholics, and our mission is to the entire church. The entire church that stands on the Apostles' Creed, on the firm foundation of the gospel.
And I think that's a good point, maybe even to help conclude our time. We get into the theological weeds on this show, and we believe it matters. Our very introduction, we help goers think and thinkers go. But I made a comment earlier, we're Baptists, help us understand, right? And that's not to say that these dividing lines between denominations or streams of Christian history don't matter over the ages. But it's also important for us to know that we are not saved by perfection of doctrine. And because of that, even though we don't have regeneration goggles, I can't know for sure who's a nominal Christian across the world and who's a truly regenerated follower of Christ. But we can't, simply because we're evangelicals, we can't choose to leave off whole portions of the global body of Christ because they wear funny looking hats or because they're chanting in different languages or these sorts of things and I realize that's more superficial and there's still other things that certainly matter that we could be drawn to, but our Lord has his people in every nation and in every corner of the world. And as the church has developed throughout the ages, we rejoice in looking back on an ancient community and seeing how the gospel went there in the earliest period of history. But we also recognize we still have an obligation to them today, to pray, to support the work of ministry happening there for sure. And so is there any particular way that somebody could take action through CSI and other ways as well? I know we mentioned even reaching out to representatives, asking them to weigh in on these things.
Sure. If you feel led to contribute to CSI's efforts to help the refugees, the best way to do that is to go to our website. That's www.csi-usa.org. And if you feel led to call your representatives, you can tell them simply that you know what's happening, you're upset about it, and that they should support Resolution 5686. I'll say that again, Resolution 5686.
Appreciate that. And we'll also be doing research within the ABWE world as well. And if there's other ways to give, whether it's through ABWE's Europe Compassion Fund or other opportunities like that, it sounds like we're going to be dealing with this for years. Refugees continuing to span out throughout Europe and Central Asia. And so we'll include other relevant links in the show notes. Be sure to check that out before you navigate away and listen to the next show in your feed. Joel, thank you so much for joining us today. We deeply appreciate your expertise on this topic. And listeners, we thank you for being a part of this today as well. The Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com. You can support the work of this show by hitting the support tab at the top. And you know that, as always, one of the best ways that you can support our efforts is by leaving a positive rating and review in your platform of choice. That'll help the platform to know that other people are seeing this content and being blessed by it. To learn more about ABWE, head on over to abwe.org. And while you're there, if you're also interested in stories of missionaries who've been faithful through the years, check out our newest podcast offering as well. That's cloudofwitnessespodcast.com, or you can get it straight from ABWE. If you have any questions, if you'd like to get in touch with Joel, or if you have any more thoughts that you'd like to share with us, email alex@missionspodcast.com or scott@missionspodcast.com. We would love to hear from you. Until next week, go make disciples of all nations. Thank you for joining us.